Prime Minister Keir Starmer is a very unpopular Prime Minister. As of May, 71% of the public think Starmer is doing badly as Prime Minister. In fact, even a former Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, recently criticised the government for its overall direction. But I think Starmer's premiership so far is slightly more mixed. Some of the policies he's introduced are fairly reasonable. Firstly, Starmer's employee rights bill expands protections for employees. Exploitative zero-hour contract practices and fire and rehire practices are being restricted. Additionally, workers will gain day one statutory sick pay and parental leave rights. You may be thinking this is going to hurt employers and therefore the overall economy. However, a government analysis argues this is going to have a slight positive overall effect on the economy. On the other hand, a report done by the Resolution Foundation, which is an independent economic think tank, estimates the bill will have little impact on the economy, but it will have a big positive effect on low-income workers. Moreover, this would not make the United Kingdom an outlier in employee rights, it would simply move us towards the OECD average for employee protections. Of course, these are projections about the future, so it should be taken with a pinch of salt, but if it improves the lives of millions of UK workers, I think it's a good policy from Starmer. The Renters' Rights Bill is another reasonable policy. In the private rental sector, landlords can no longer evict tenants without illegal reason. Most tenancies become open-ended periodic contracts, rental bidding wars are banned, and rental increases are limited to once per year. Broadly speaking, the government argues that strengthening renters' rights will empower tenants to make complaints about poor housing conditions without fear of eviction, while also improving housing stability for families. The full reasoning behind this policy and what effect it might have are laid out in an impact assessment document. This same document was also judged to be methodologically fit for purpose by an independent regulatory policy committee. Essentially, this committee just double checks whether the government's arguments and the speculated outcomes are reasonable or not. Though, the committee does note that parts of the modelling were weak. Nevertheless, the government will monitor and evaluate how the plan is working. So, overall, I think it's a reasonable piece of legislation. Starmer's government is also reforming planning rules with their planning and infrastructure bill. The bill is basically designed to make it faster and easier to build by simplifying local planning decisions, speeding up major infrastructure approvals, improving regional planning coordination, and changing environmental rules so development isn't delayed as often. The reforms are expected to contribute to economic growth, housing delivery, and infrastructure expansion, and the impact assessment was rated fit for purpose by the Regulatory Policy Committee. Meanwhile, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has highlighted that restrictive building policies, such as the Greenbelt restrictions around cities, create housing shortages and reduce labour mobility, meaning people are less able to move to areas where the job market is booming. Over time, that can hurt productivity and economic growth. Hence, Starmer's plan to make it easier to build seems like a reasonable idea. Of course, some critics argue the legislation doesn't go far enough and a more radical overhaul of the planning system is needed. Nevertheless, I would argue that some progress is better than complete paralysis, but time will tell. Net zero as a policy is interesting, and it's something that Tony Blair specifically criticised the government over in his recent essay, which I think is slightly unfair. Net zero is essentially a policy that means by 2050, the UK will add no more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than it removes. A policy like this obviously means many sectors of the economy will need to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels in order to get closer to net zero emissions. Currently, there is a huge amount of debate about the cost. Yet, there is a strong reason why keeping net zero might be a good idea. The Climate Change Committee, which is an independent statutory body that advises the UK's governments, recently published a report making a strong case for why it's important to keep net zero. The report states that the path to net zero would cost around $4 billion per year on average between 2025 and 2050. Obviously, $4 billion is a sizable chunk of change. However, according to the report, reaching net zero by 2050 is still cheaper than one energy shock akin to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, if this is true, I can see why the government is reluctant to change course. Though, this is going to require a huge amount of infrastructure, and given the UK's track record with big infrastructure projects, such as HS2, I don't think it's outlandish to think that the cost of the infrastructure might be a lot more than they're predicting. But hopefully I'm wrong. Now, you may disagree with net zero, but it isn't irrational. The government is relying on the advice from the UK's statutory climate advisors. So once again, I don't think Starmer is being particularly crazy. However, there are several issues that I believe really call into question whether Starmer can actually deliver. For example, Starmer's failure to bring the ballooning cost of welfare under control. Despite Starmer attempting to reform part of the welfare system, he wasn't able to bring his party with him, and after a major Labour backbench rebellion, he was forced to abandon much of the reform. Yet, Starmer has managed some small tweaks. Under the current plan, the health element of universal credit is being restructured. New claimants will now receive a lower rate, though existing claimants plus new claimants with more severe health issues will still receive a higher rate. But this tweak is a significant climb down from what was initially proposed, so it's unclear how much it's going to save. This is extremely disappointing because obviously the country needs to make savings. Another failure concerns Starmer's inability to tackle unauthorised entries into the United Kingdom. For example, in 2025, over 41,000 people were detected crossing the channel in small boats. This is the second highest amount recorded. I appreciate that this is a very difficult issue to tackle, as many European countries are also struggling to get a grip of it. But the public have a right to determine who gains entry to their country, and therefore the government needs to devise some method of reducing irregular migration. Finally, the issue that concerns me the most is Starmer's slow progress on increasing military spending. Clearly, the fiscal situation is extremely challenging. I do appreciate that. But if we don't spend more money on our armed forces, I think it is highly likely that Russia will attack us or one of our allies, and we will be completely unprepared. Ultimately, I think there are several positive policies Starmer has introduced. It's also worth noting that Starmer inherited an extremely difficult situation left by the Tories, not to mention Donald Trump's persistent attacks towards the United Kingdom. But if Starmer can't deliver, I fear that our politics will descend further into chaos, shifting from one extreme to the other, which I believe would be disastrous for this country, especially if we find ourselves at war.